Trapped on her own land, Junia Vane was harassed 3 times a day for 2 months, unaware the brother who would save her life was already riding home. Dawn to scare her horses into a lathered panic against the corral rails. Noon to spit and paw through her cook fire, until the beans were fit for nothing but the dogs. Sundown to plant themselves on her porch step hats, pushed back, grinning, and reminder, again, patient as a held breath, that she wasn't welcome on ground her own dead husband had bled to keep. The town of Silver Creek looked the other way, the way it always had. Junia never once looked away first. This was New Mexico territory in the autumn of 1883, along a green thread of river country known as the Mimbres, where good water ran scarcer than good men, and a widow, sitting on the best stretch of both, was to a certain breed of coward. Her name was Junia Vane, 28 years old, and for 2 years she had worked her husband's ranch entirely alone, refusing every offer of Christian charity from the churchwomen of Silver Creek and every lowball offer from the man trying to buy her off her own deed. What nobody in that town knew, not the sheriff who wouldn't meet her eye, not the 3 men circling her gate like buzzards who'd already picked the carcass, was that her older brother was 3 days out and closing fast. And that he was about to teach every last one of them the true cost of what they had been doing to his sister. Stick with this one to the very end, because before 2 more sunrises come up over that river, the quietest ranch in the Mimbres Valley is going to turn into the loudest night New Mexico territory has heard in a decade. And if you've got a taste for stories about ordinary people who turn out to have extraordinary people watching over them, go ahead and subscribe now, because this channel brings you one of these every single week. Hollis Vane had been a chief scout out of Fort Bayard, a lean, quiet man who read sign the way other men read scripture, and he had built this ranch with his own 2 hands along the eastern bend of the Mimbres, where the river ran wide and slow and never once failed even in the driest August the valley could remember. 2 years back, chasing a band of renegades who'd slipped off the reservation, he had ridden into a box canyon everybody now knew as Deadman's Draw, and never ridden out of it again. And the army had sent Junia his effects in a canvas sack, his pocket watch, his wedding band, a letter he'd never finished. For no pension worth mentioning, no help, no apology. She had buried him on the rise behind the house he'd always wanted to be laid to rest on, and she had gone right on running the 22 head of cattle and the garden and the well exactly the way he'd taught her, because grief, in her accounting, was a debt you paid in private. She did not weep where anyone could see it. She sought nothing from Silver Creek, not one single thing, and it was precisely that, not her land, not her water, though those mattered plenty too, that certain men in the valley had decided they could not forgive her for. The half-section itself was not especially large by the standards of that country, scarcely 300 acres in total, but nearly every one of those acres touched water in some fashion that mattered, a long, fertile stretch of bottomland, a stand of old cottonwoods that gave shade to cattle through the worst of the summer heat, and a full quarter-mile of river frontage that determined, in practical terms, how easily every smaller rancher downstream could water a herd without begging a favor of whoever held the ground upstream of them. Junia understood that arithmetic as well as anyone in the valley, understood that the hunger certain men felt looking at her fence line had nothing sentimental in it whatsoever, and she rose every single morning before first light, regardless of how little sleep or hope she'd carried into bed the night before. Because livestock did not pause to consider whose grief kept a woman from her chores. and because on the very worst mornings the only thing that got her feet onto the cold floorboards was the plain, unglamorous certainty Garrett Pruitt had come west a dozen years earlier, meaning to make his fortune killing buffalo, back when there had still been buffalo worth the killing, and when the herds thinned out from under him, he had drifted into cattle instead, buying up failing spreads along both banks of the Membres for pennies on the dollar, until he controlled nearly every good mile of river frontage in the valley, nearly every mile except the half section. It sat like a splinter in the middle of Garrett's holdings, cutting his upstream herds off from his downstream herds, forcing his riders on a 2-hour detour around ground he considered rightfully his simply because he wanted it more than she did. He had a face like sour milk, pale and soft and faintly curdled, and a way of smiling when he made people afraid that made plain fear was not a means to an end for Garrett Pruitt so much as a pleasure. He developed a taste for the way another man develops a taste for good whiskey. He had proposed to buy Junia out at half of what the land was worth, exactly once, the spring after Hollis died, and when she'd refused him in about as many words as that, he had gone quiet for a long moment, then smiled that curdled smile. Everybody always did. He had done this before, more than once, and always with the same patient, bloodless method. 2 winters passed. A family who'd worked a smaller spread just south of the Vane place had put up with a season of unexplained fires and a well that mysteriously soured until they'd finally decided the country simply wasn't worth dying over, and they'd sold out to Garrett at a fraction of its true worth. Publicly, why? Junia had heard the story secondhand, the way everybody eventually heard everything in a town as small as Silver Creek, and she understood with total clarity long before Garrett's cousins ever set foot on her land. She only intended to be the first who refused to go. His cousins rode with him everywhere he went, 2 men who had never in their lives amounted to anything on their own, and had therefore attached themselves permanently to a man who at least amounted to something ugly. Dade Pruitt had a temper that lit like dry kindling in a hand that drifted to his gun before his brain had finished deciding whether it needed to, and more than one saloon in Silver Creek had banned him outright for exactly that reason. Cully Pruitt was the smaller of the 2, narrow and quick and cruel in the particular way of a man who has spent his whole life being underestimated and has decided the only cure for it is making sure everyone around him. Neither one of them was famous. Neither one of them was even especially good with a gun, not by the standards of men who actually earned their reputations. What they were good at, the 3 of them together, was finding one person too proud to run and too alone to fight back, and grinding at her, patiently, methodically, until the grinding did the work that a single dramatic act of violence never quite could. Between them, the cousins had been run out of 2 other counties on suspicion of cattle theft that nobody had ever managed to prove in a courtroom, and Dade in particular carried a knife scar along one forearm from a card game gone bad in a mining camp. Neither he nor Cully liked to discuss. By small permanent reminder that the 2 of them had spent their whole lives on the losing end of trouble, right up until they'd found a cousin with enough land and money to make sure the trouble started landing on. So it began, in the first week of that August, and it never once let up for 2 solid months. At dawn, before Junia had even finished her coffee, the 3 of them would come thundering across her north pasture, whooping and firing their pistols into the air, sending her horses into a screaming, wheeling panic against the corral rails until she had chased and gentled and counted every single one of them twice over, to be certain none had broken a leg in the dark. At noon, while she was cooking the one hot meal she allowed herself in a day of unrelenting work, they would ride up slow and easy, dismount without asking, and walk straight into her yard to spit in her cook fire, kick over her wash bucket, paw through the little she owned on her porch as though inventorying it for the day it would belong to somebody else. At sundown, when the light went long and gold across the river, and any reasonable person might have hoped the day was finally mercifully over, they would come one final time to sit their horses at her gate and remind her unhurried, almost neighborly in their tone, that a woman alone had no business holding ground this good. That the valley would be a great deal friendlier to her the very day she packed up and left it. A neighbor 2 sections over, an aging widower named Silas Boone, who had known Hollis Vane well enough to call him a friend, watched a good part of the noon ritual unfold from his own fence line more than once that summer, because Silas Boone leased grazing rights from Garrett Pruitt on land he could not afford to lose either, and courage, he had discovered somewhere in his 60-odd years, was a good deal easier to admire in other people than to practice himself when the cost of it might be his own livelihood. Junia never once held it against him aloud, though something in her went a little quieter and a little more solitary every time she caught him looking away. They killed her dog in the 4th week, a rangy yellow mutt named Scout that Hollis had raised from a pup and that had slept at the foot of her bed every night since he died, and left the body where she'd find it first thing in the morning. They cut her fence line in the 5th week and drove half her cattle out onto open range, costing her 3 exhausting days of riding to gather them back before wolves or rustlers found them first, and left the wire lying in the dirt as though it had simply failed on its own. They burned her garden in the 6th week, the whole careful season's worth of beans and squash and corn she'd been counting on to see her through the winter, and stood at the fence watching it smolder with an expression Junia would later describe, to the one person who ever pressed her to describe it, as men enjoying a show they'd paid good money for. The churchwomen of Silver Creek offered their own particular version of help that summer, the kind that cost them nothing and demanded everything in return. Twice a delegation of them rode out to the Vane place with baskets of bread and quilts and gentle, well-meaning suggestions that a woman alone really ought to consider what was best for her, meaning, though none of them would say it outright, that she ought to sell to Garrett Pruitt and move into town where decent folk could keep a proper eye on her. Junia thanked them for the bread and declined every suggestion tucked inside the basket along with it, and after the 2nd visit, the basket stopped coming, because charity, she had noticed, tended to evaporate the moment it stopped being convenient too often. She rode into Silver Creek and sought help from Sheriff Otis Reddick exactly twice, and both times he found reasons the law couldn't quite reach that far out of town on a Tuesday, or that Wednesday, or whatever day it happened to be when she came. Reddick was not a cruel man so much as a tired and cowardly one, a man who had learned a long time ago that keeping the peace in Silver Creek mostly meant keeping Garrett Pruitt's temper unruffled. He explained the 2nd time, not quite meeting her eyes, that these things had a way of working themselves out, that a woman running a ranch alone faced hardships, everybody understood, and that if she found the life too difficult, what he meant and what she heard perfectly clearly, underneath the polite words, was that he had already decided how this was going to end and simply hadn't found the nerve to say it plainly. He figured she'd eventually just run. And the sooner she accepted that, the sooner everyone in Silver Creek could stop feeling vaguely uncomfortable about the whole business. He did not once, in either conversation, ask her whether she was afraid, or offer to so much as ride out and take a look at the burned garden with his own eyes, and Junia understood by the second visit that the badge on his vest, a symbol of an authority Sheriff Reddick had no real intention of spending on behalf of a woman who couldn't pay for it in cattle money the way Garrett Pruitt could. Junia did not run. She buried her dog on the rise beside her husband, and the next morning she was up before dawn feeding the horses she had spent half the night gentling, because a ranch did not tend itself, simply because its owner had a broken heart, and because some stubborn, unbendable part of her had decided a long time ago, long before Garrett Pruitt ever rode onto her land, that she would rather be worn down to the bone on ground she loved than comfortable one single day anywhere else. What she did do, quietly, in the 7th week, was write a letter. She addressed it to an army post 2 territories away, to the only man she knew who might actually come, and she gave it to a freighter heading east with instructions to place it in no hands but the post commander's own, and then she went back to work without breathing a word of it to anyone in Silver Creek, because hope, like grief, was something Junia Vane had learned to keep entirely to herself. If a story like Junia's keeps you watching this late, become a channel member. Tap the join button beside the channel name. It costs a moment, and it means the world to a small channel like this one. The letter reached her brother 11 days later, forwarded twice by men who owed him favors older than most of their careers, and by the time he'd finished reading it, standing in the dust outside a trading post, he was 36 years old, 6 years Junia's senior, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades as a chief scout for the Army, first tracking renegades through country so broken and merciless, after a falling out with a colonel whose orders he'd refused to follow because they amounted to murdering unarmed people, tracking nothing at all except the next quiet place to disappear into. That colonel had a great deal of family in Washington and a great deal of interest in making sure his own version of the story was the one that survived, and so Reuben Cole rode out of that command with a warrant on his head in 3 different territories and a reputation among the handful of men who'd actually served alongside him. As the finest scout who ever read a trail, a man some knew as the Ghost of the Rim, because he could put a war party on his back trail and vanish into broken country like smoke going up a canyon, and because nobody who'd ever truly crossed him. The name had been earned 2 summers before his falling out, in a stretch of shattered mesa country up along the Gila, where a renegade band had been raiding isolated ranches for the better part of a month, while 3 separate Army details failed to so much as cut a fresh trail. Reuben had gone in alone, on foot the last 2 days to keep from raising dust, and had come back out 5 days later, having located their camp, their numbers, and their intended next target with such precision. Men who had served with him passed that story along for years afterward in a dozen different versions, and every version agreed on the one detail that mattered. Nobody had ever managed to explain how a man moved through country that broken without leaving a single sign of his own passing. He had blued twin colts he'd carried since the war before the last one, a face weathered 10 years past its true age by sun and grief and things he did not discuss, and precisely one soft spot left in a heart that had otherwise gone hard as flint, his little sister, the only family he had left in the world, and the one person whose handwriting he would recognize on an envelope from clear across a crowded trading post. He rode 3 days at a pace that would have killed a lesser horse, sleeping 4 hours a night if that, living on jerked beef and cold coffee, because 2 months of daily terror described in his sister's own careful, deliberately understated hand had made plain everything her pride would never let her say outright. That she was exhausted, and that she had not sought his help, until there was truly nowhere else left to turn. He crossed 2 mountain ranges and a stretch of alkali flat that had killed careless travelers in every season Reuben could remember. And he did it without once slowing his pace, because every hour he spent resting was an hour Junia spent alone with 3 men who had already made plain. Twice he swapped his exhausted horse for a fresher one at ranches whose owners recognized him on sight and wanted no payment beyond a promise that he'd do the same for them someday, because a man with Reuben Cole's reputation. He came down out of the hill country above the Mimbres on the morning of the 9th week, just as the sun was breaking pink and gold over the eastern ridgeline, and he reined up on a rise a half-mile from his sister's house at the precise moment. Every single morning for 2 months running, only this time it did not stop at horses and noise. Garrett Pruitt, restless with a temper, Junia's continued refusals had been fraying thinner by the week, swung down from his saddle in her yard, crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides, and seized her by the arm, hard enough to spin her half around, slamming her back against the cedar fence rail with a force that knocked the breath clean out of her. Dade and Cully were off their own horses in an instant, each one grabbing an arm, pinning her against the rail while Garrett leaned in close. That curdled smile, spreading, telling her this was the morning she was finally going to sign the paper he'd been carrying folded in his vest pocket for 2 solid months. From the rise, Reuben watched every second of it happen through the pale morning light, and something in his chest went very still and very cold. Not the hot, reckless fury of a young man, but the older, quieter kind that had kept him alive through 15 years of country. For one long breath, he simply took the scene in the way he had once taken in enemy camps from a ridgeline before deciding how to move against them, counting heads, marking who carried a rifle and who carried only a sidearm, noting which of the 3 men gripping his sister looked nervous and which looked comfortable, because comfortable men were always the ones you dealt with first. He did not spur his horse into a gallop. He nudged it forward at an unhurried walk instead, down the long slope toward the yard, letting the 3 of them see him coming from a considerable distance, letting every one of those unhurried, deliberate hoofbeats land on them like the ticking of a clock they hadn't known was running. Garrett noticed him first, straightened, one hand drifting toward his gun belt without quite committing to it. Dade noticed second, and something in the stranger's flat, patient approach made even his quick temper hesitate. Reuben did not stop his horse until he was close enough that his shadow fell across all 4 of them, and only then, in a voice pitched low and even and utterly without heat, did he speak the 2 words that would end that particular morning of his sister's life for good. Let her go. Dade Pruitt, being the kind of man whose hand moved faster than his judgment ever had, went for his own gun instead. He never cleared leather. A single crack split the morning air, and Dade's revolver spun out of a hand suddenly gone bloody and useless at the wrist, clattering into the dust 6 feet away, while he stared at it with an expression of pure, uncomprehending shock. Reuben had not even fully raised his Colt to aim it, had barely seemed to move at all, and the speed of that single shot did more to empty the fight out of Cully's grip on Junia's arm than any amount of shouting could have managed. Reuben's gun swung, unhurried, until it settled squarely on Garrett Pruitt's chest, and his voice, when it came again, had not risen half a note. I said, let her go. Junia stepped away from the fence rail on legs that trembled only slightly, straightened her dress with a small, deliberate motion that cost her more composure than anyone watching could have guessed, and crossed the yard to stand at her brother's stirrup. looking up at him with an expression that held relief and fury and 2 years of exhaustion all tangled together into something too complicated for a single word. "You took your time getting here," she said, and it was not quite a rebuke and not quite forgiveness either, but something in between that only a sister could offer a brother she loved too much to stay angry at for long. Reuben's eyes never left Garrett's face. He laid it out for the man plainly, without a single wasted syllable. The harassment ended today, that he had until sundown to be gone from the valley entirely, and that if he or his cousins ever set foot on Vane land again, he would not get a second warning shot aimed at a wrist. Garrett, backing toward his horse with Dade cradling his ruined hand and Cully white-faced beside him, found what remained of his nerve long enough to promise this wasn't finished, that he'd bring the law, that he'd bring every man in the county who owed him a favor. Reuben watched him ride off without a flicker of concern crossing his weathered face, because he had spent 15 years learning to read exactly this kind of man, and he knew with total certainty that Garrett Pruitt was not riding toward Sheriff Reddick's office. Cowards like Garrett didn't go looking for the law when they'd been humiliated in front of witnesses. They went looking for whiskey and for men meaner than themselves, and they came back after dark when they imagined the odds had shifted back in their favor. Quick ask, before we get to what happens tonight. Become a channel member. Tap Join beside the channel name. It helps keep stories like this one coming, and it takes about 10 seconds. Reuben spent the rest of that day the way a scout spends the hours before he knows trouble is coming, which is to say, methodically and without a wasted motion. He walked every inch of the property with Junia at his side, noting the lay of the ground the way he'd once read the lay of ambush country for the army, the dry arroyo that cut along the northern boundary and gave the easiest cover for riders wanting to come in unseen. The single stand of cottonwoods that would let a man move close without being silhouetted against the sky. He put a dozen small, precise questions to her as they walked, where the well sat relative to the porch, how far the nearest neighbor's house stood, and whether anyone there would hear gunfire and come running, or simply bolt their own doors tighter, since a fire set with the wind at its back could jump from barn to house faster than any man could outrun it. Junia answered every question as best she could, and somewhere in the careful, methodical rhythm of it, she found herself trusting her brother's competence the same unquestioning way she'd once trusted her father's, a trust built not on blind faith but on watching, over the course of one long afternoon, exactly how thoroughly he thought through every possible way this night could go wrong before it ever had the chance to. He strung what wire he could find between fence posts at ankle height in the arroyo's mouth, tied a scatter of tin cans and horseshoes along it so that anything larger than a jackrabbit moving through in the dark would announce itself with noise. Inside the barn shadowed interior with a clear line on the yard and the house both. He put Junia at the front bedroom window with Hollis's old double-barrel shotgun broken open across her knees, and more shells than she'd ever need laid out on the sill beside her, and though she protested at first that she wasn't some helpless thing needing to be hidden away, he explained gently, for him, that the window was not a hiding place. It was a position, and that he needed her there, because he trusted her aim and her nerve both, which was, in its own way, the truest compliment he had ever paid her. He walked her through it twice, patiently, the way their father had once walked the two of them through, loading a rifle in the dark, without wasting a single motion, how to hold low and steady rather than flinch back from the recoil, how to wait for a clear shape rather than fire at noise or shadow, how a person's own fear, left unmanaged, could get her killed a great deal faster than any man on the other end of a gun. Junia listened to every word of it with the same fierce concentration she'd once brought to learning her husband's ledgers, because she understood, without needing convincing twice, that the difference between surviving this night and not surviving it, practiced detail her brother was taking such care to teach her. They talked, in the hours of waiting that followed, about things they had not spoken of aloud in years. Their parents, dead of fever within a season of each other back in the settled country. Patient in a way, he was rarely patient about anything else. Hollis, and the particular, quiet grief of losing a husband to a war that never officially ended, in a canyon. Reuben let her know, in the flat, unadorned way he approached most things, that he had read her letter 40 times on the ride down, and that not one of those readings had made him any less furious that she'd waited 2 full months before sending it. Junia countered just as plainly that she'd been raised by the same stubborn parents he had, and that asking for help had never once come naturally to either of them. Somewhere in that conversation, without either of them quite naming it, the old easy closeness of their childhood settled back over the space between them, the particular comfort of 2 people who had survived the same losses. Junia wondered aloud to him once, quietly, whether he was afraid of what tonight might cost him, given the warrant on his head and everything it meant if the fighting drew the wrong kind of attention, and Reuben considered the question longer than she expected before answering that fear had stopped meaning much to him somewhere in the last 15 years. Not because he'd grown reckless, but because he had learned that the only thing worse than dying for something was living a long, safe life, having never once stood for anything at all. She did not have a reply for that. She simply reached over in the lamplight and squeezed his hand, the way she used to when they were children and one of them had a nightmare, and he squeezed back, and neither of them raised it again before the waiting. Garrett Pruitt, meanwhile, was doing exactly what Reuben had predicted. He rode straight to the Silver Dollar saloon in town, nursing a bandaged cousin and a bruised pride that hurt considerably worse than Dade's wrist did, and by the time full dark had settled over the valley he had gathered 5 hired guns, drifters and out-of-work cowhands who cared nothing for Junia Vane or Garrett Pruitt's grievances and everything, for the $50 a head he was offering to finish what his cousins had started. He assured them there was only one man on the property, a stranger, nothing they couldn't handle in the dark, with 5 guns against his 1. He did not mention the man had disarmed Dade with a single shot from a moving horse, without seeming to try especially hard, because Garrett Pruitt, like most cruel men, had never once in his life let an inconvenient fact interfere with a plan he'd already decided he wanted. Somewhere past 10 o'clock, 8 riders total, Garrett Cully and 6 hired guns, Dade left behind nursing his wrist and his humiliation both, set out from Silver Creek toward the Vane Ranch, coal oil bottles rattling, meaning to finish by fire what pistols and threats had failed to accomplish. They came in through the dry arroyo just past midnight, exactly as Reuben had guessed they would, and the tin can wire did its work within the first 50 yards. A sudden clatter of horseshoes and metal that sent 2 of the hired gun's horses shying and gave Reuben, crouched in the barn's shadow with his Winchester across his knees, every second of warning he needed. He counted 8 shapes moving through the moonlight and let them come the rest of the way in on their own momentum, because a man who has already given away his position has given away his only real advantage. One of the hired guns, a rangy Texan named Purdy, who'd ridden with worse men than Garrett Pruitt, and lived to spend the money, griped into the dark that he didn't much care for the quiet. A man in his line of work developed a nose for ambush, because Reuben had already marked his voice and his position both, and filed the information away for exactly the moment it would matter most. Garrett's voice carried from 30 yards off the porch, that same curdled confidence it always had, demanding Junia come out and sign the paper now, tonight, before things got a great deal worse for her, and to prove he meant it, he lifted a coal oil bottle high enough that moonlight caught the glass, a torch already burning in his other hand. "We're going to burn this whole place to the ground," his voice cracked slightly on the last word, "starting with the barn your dead husband built with his own 2 hands. Reuben stepped out of the barn shadow into the open yard, unhurried, both Colts still holstered, his Winchester held loose and easy across his body. "That's a lot of talk," he said, "for a man standing in the dark." The words had barely finished leaving his mouth when Garrett, startled and furious in equal measure, hurled the coal oil bottle anyway, not at Reuben, but at the barn's near wall, where it shattered and caught with a whomp of orange flame that lit the entire yard bright as noon and turned every man in it into a clear target for anyone with the nerve to use the light. That was the moment the shooting started in earnest, muzzle flashes stuttering out of the darkness from 6 different directions at once, and Reuben went down flat behind a stock trough with the calm, practiced economy of a man who had done exactly this 100 times before in country a great deal less forgiving than a member's ranch yard, firing careful, aimed. Shots at each flash the instant he saw it, rather than wasting lead, spraying at shadows. Purdy, the rangy Texan who'd worried aloud about the quiet, was the second man he put down, caught mid-stride trying to circle wide toward the barn's blind side, and the shock of losing their most experienced gun inside the first half-minute did more to rattle the remaining hired men. A bullet clipped the trough an inch from Reuben's shoulder and sent splinters stinging across his cheek, close enough that a lesser man might have flinched into a worse position, but he only shifted his angle a half-foot and kept firing, patient and unhurried even with lead cutting the air around him, because panic, he had learned a long time ago, killed more good men than bad aim ever did. Up in the front bedroom window, Junia Vane had her shotgun already leveled across the sill, and when one of the hired guns broke from cover to circle wide toward the house, meaning, she understood instantly, to come at her brother's flank while his attention was fixed on the men in front of him, before 2 months of daily terror had burned every last flinch out of her, she tracked him across the yard by the flame light exactly the way Reuben had shown her that afternoon, led him the way you lead a running deer, and squeezed both triggers together. The hired gun went down hard in the dirt and did not get back up, and in the sudden ringing quiet that followed her own shot, Junia realized, with a strange fierce clarity, that she was not shaking anymore. She had just done the saving herself, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 2 solid months finally, quietly, let go. The fight in the yard did not last much longer after that. Reuben emptied the Winchester at 2 more muzzle flashes, dropped it, and came up out of cover with a blued Colt in each hand, walking forward into the firelight rather than away from it, because he had learned a long time ago. He put down the last of the hired guns and 3 shot so close together they sounded almost like one continuous roar, and Cully Pruitt, seeing the last of the men he'd ridden in with either dead or fled into the dark, threw down his own pistol and bolted for his horse without a single word, disappearing back up the arroyo at a dead run, and not once looking back. That left Garrett alone in the middle of his own burning ambition, the barn wall crackling and smoking behind him, on his knees in the dirt where a stray shot had caught him through the meat of one thigh, crawling backward through the mud with both hands raised, Dwight replaced by something a great deal closer to the fear. He had spent 2 months teaching Junia Vane to feel every single day. The firelight threw his shadow, long and broken, across the scorched ground, and for one strange moment the man who had built his whole small, ugly empire on other people's terror found himself on the receiving end of it, begging in a cracked, unsteady voice for a mercy he had never once considered extending to the widow. Reuben crossed the yard and hauled him up by the collar, not gently, and dragged him the last few feet to the same cedar fence rail he had slammed Junia against that very morning. 3 times a day, Reuben said, low, and something in the flat evenness of his voice was worse, Garrett would later admit to no one, than any amount of shouting could have been. That's how many times you came onto my sister's land to terrorize her. I'm only going to come here once, and it's going to be the last time either of us needs to. He made plain to Garrett Pruitt that if he was ever seen anywhere in the Members Valley again, Reuben would not waste a second bullet, warning him he'd simply let the desert have whatever was left. Garrett did not argue. He could not have managed a full sentence if his life had depended on it, which, in that particular moment, it very much did. He crawled onto a horse someone had left behind in the panic and rode north out of the valley before dawn, and no one in Silver Creek ever laid eyes on him again. Junia and Reuben spent the last hour before daylight hauling water from the well to douse what remained of the burning barn wall, working side by side in a silence that had nothing exhausted or defeated left in it, only the particular hard-won quiet of 2 people who had just survived something together and come out the other side still standing. The eastern sky had barely begun to gray when they heard hoofbeats again, a great many of them this time, moving at a disciplined trot rather than a panic gallop, and Reuben's hand went briefly to his Colt before he recognized the shape of the column coming down the river road and let it fall back to his side. A patrol of the 9th Cavalry, 30 riders strong, came into the yard just as the sun cleared the ridgeline, and at their head sat a sergeant named Emmett Louth, a broad-weathered man who took one long look at Reuben Cole's face across the smoking yard. The 2 of them had served together under the same colonel years before Reuben's falling out, had ridden the same brutal country side by side, and Louth's men had heard the shooting from 3 miles off, and come to investigate exactly the kind of trouble a man like Reuben Cole tended to leave in his wake. Sergeant Louth walked the yard slowly, taking in the scorched barn wall, the bodies laid out under blankets Junia had fetched without being asked, the torn sleeve of her dress, where Garrett's grip had left bruises already darkening to purple, and he posed precisely no questions that either of them would have found difficult to answer. He had his men load the dead for transport to Silver Creek, mentioning to Reuben, with a dry, understated humor, that some things about him plainly hadn't changed, even with a price on his head, and promised before he rode out to have a quiet word with Sheriff Reddick. No jury in that territory, Louth said, was going to hang a man for defending his sister's home against 8 armed men who'd ridden in at midnight meaning to burn her out of it. And Sheriff Otis Reddick, who had spent 2 months finding excuses not to help Junia Vane, found it remarkably easy that particular morning to agree with him. The column stayed in the yard the better part of that morning while Louth's troopers finished the grim work of loading the dead, and one of the younger soldiers, a boy barely out of his teens who plainly hadn't seen much of this kind of aftermath yet, kept sneaking glances at Reuben, as though trying to decide whether the stories he'd heard about the ghost of the rim could possibly belong to the same tired, dust-covered man, standing quietly beside the well with his sister's hand resting on his arm. Lalf caught the boy staring at one point and sent him, not unkindly, to fetch fresh water for the horses and stop gawking at a man who'd earned the right to a little peace and quiet, and the boy went red to his ears and did exactly as instructed. Before the column rode out, Louth pulled Reuben aside for a private word that Junia was not meant to overhear, and whatever passed between the two men in that quiet minute, old debts settled, old griefs acknowledged, perhaps nothing more than the kind of understanding two soldiers share without ever needing to say it aloud, left Reuben standing a little straighter than he had in weeks. If this story kept you here this deep into the night, that says something about you. Become a channel member. The join button sits right beside the channel name, and it helps keep stories like this one coming. The harassment stopped that morning and never once resumed. Word travels fast in a small territory, and within a week every rancher along the Mimbres knew precisely what had happened to the men who'd spent 2 months terrorizing a widow on her own land, and precisely who her brother was. Reuben stayed on through the end of that autumn, rebuilding the barn wall with lumber he hauled in from Silver Creek himself, fixing fence, helping Junia replant a fall garden in soil that still bore faint black scars from where the old one had burned. He taught her a few things about defending ground that scouts learn, and most ranchers never do. Not because he expected trouble to come again, but because he understood, in the particular way of a man who had spent his whole adult life protecting people who could not always protect themselves, that a person who knows exactly how to fight. Junia, for her part, discovered over those weeks that having her brother under her roof again felt less like the arrival of a protector and more like the slow, quiet return of a piece of her own family. The town's reaction to the news arrived in stages, the way most towns' consciences seem to. First came the curiosity, riders finding excuses to pass by the Vane place just to see the wreckage of the barn wall and the woman who'd fired a shotgun from her own window. Then, slowly, and with the particular sheepishness of people who know exactly how little they'd done when it mattered, came something closer to shame. Silas Boone rode over himself within the week, hat in his hands the whole visit, and spent an entire afternoon helping Reuben reset fence posts without either of them saying much of anything about the noon rituals he'd once watched from his own property line. He kept coming back after that, those Sundays, bringing a jar of preserves from his own kitchen, or an extra pair of hands for whatever needed doing, and Junia let him, because she had decided a long time ago that holding a grudge against a frightened old widower, the smaller ranchers downstream, the ones who had spent years quietly worrying what would happen to their own water, once Garrett Pruitt finally pried the Vane place loose from its widow, sent word of their own gratitude in ways more practical than sentimental, offers of labor at branding time, the kind of neighborly goodwill that costs a man something real rather than merely a kind word. Junia accepted what she needed and declined the rest the same way she'd always conducted her business, but she noticed, and it mattered to her more than she ever let on, that an entire valley's worth of people who had watched her suffer in silence for 2 months were now belatedly choosing to stand somewhere closer to her side of the fence. Even Sheriff Reddick found a late, quiet kind of courage, riding out personally to inform Junia that the county would be filing no charges whatsoever against the man who had defended her home, and staying long enough afterward to help Reuben haul the last of the burned barn timber to the trash pile. a gesture that fooled nobody into thinking the sheriff had grown especially brave, but that Junia accepted anyway, because a late apology, however imperfect, was still worth more than none at all. But Reuben Cole had never in his adult life stayed anywhere longer than the trouble that brought him there required, and both of them understood, without ever quite saying it plainly, that this particular arrangement could not last forever. There was still a warrant with his name on it in 3 territories. Still men out there who remembered the colonel's version of events better than the true one, and a man like Reuben belonged, in the end, to the high, broken country he had spent his whole life learning to read, however dearly he loved the sister who worked it. He made that clear to her on a cold, clear morning in late November, standing beside his saddled horse in a yard that no longer held a single trace of ash or fear in it, and Junia, who had learned a long time ago not to ask her brother for more than he could honestly give, only nodded and let him know she understood. Before he mounted up, the 2 of them walked together to the rise behind the house one final time, to the grave marked with a plain wooden cross, and Hollis Vane's name burned careful into the crossbar, and Reuben stood beside his sister in silence for a long while. The way a man pays respects to someone he never got the chance to meet, but whose absence he had spent a month quietly, thoroughly avenging anyway. "Keep the land," Reuben said, swinging up into the saddle, and there was more feeling packed into those 2 plain words than either of them would have known how to unpack in a longer sentence. It was always worth every bit of what it cost you to hold on to it. Junia stood at her gate and watched him ride north into a morning already going pale gold with the first true chill of winter, watched him grow smaller and smaller against the wide New Mexico sky, until he was nothing but a shadow moving through the heat shimmer where the road met the horizon. She did not cry. She had learned over 2 years and 2 months of the hardest grief and the hardest fear a person could be made to carry, that some goodbyes were not losses so much as promises, and that a brother like Reuben Cole, once found again, was never truly gone for good. He wrote to her that winter, and again in the spring, brief unadorned letters that revealed almost nothing of where he was or what trouble he might be riding through, because some of that she understood. He would never be able to put safely on paper as long as 3 territories still wanted him hanged for the sin of refusing an order that would have gotten innocent people killed. She kept every one of those letters in the same small cedar box where she'd once kept Hollis's unfinished last letter and his wedding band, not because the 2 men belonged in the same category of loss, but because both represented, in their own way, the particular ache of loving someone. The ranch prospered in the years that followed, in a way it never quite had while Garrett Pruitt's shadow hung over it. Her herd grew past 30 head. Her garden came in full and green every single season, and the water that had once made her a target became steady, blessing her husband had always meant it to be. The Vane Ranch stands along the Members River to this day, in the story the old-timers still tell, and the men who once terrorized a widow there are remembered, if they're remembered at all, only as a cautionary tale about the particular foolishness of underestimating a woman. Justice, in that valley, did not arrive wearing a badge or riding at the head of an army column. It arrived on a tired horse after a 200-mile ride, wearing a dust-worn duster and carrying twin-blued Colts, because somewhere along the hardest road life had ever handed him, Reuben Cole had learned the one lesson that mattered more than any other. That courage is simply the choice that something else, someone else, matters more than your own safety ever could. And it arrived, too, in a widow who never once needed rescuing so much as she needed someone to finally stand beside her, a woman who had already proven 3 times a day for 2 solid months that she would not be broken by patience alone, picked up a shotgun, and made absolutely certain of it herself. Thank you for riding all the way to the end of Junia and Ruben's story with us tonight. If it moved you, hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who needs to hear that the people we love are worth every risk it takes to protect them.